Bona tarda, good evening. It is for me a great pleasure to welcome you to this event. It's a collaboration between two institutions that are very center of my heart, Cercle d'Economia and the Barcelona School of Economics. This is not the first time there is a collaboration between the two institutions, and hopefully it will not be the last one either. Just to give you context, the Barcelona School of Economics has a scientific council that advises us on education and research and meets in Barcelona every 3 years. Today, we count with 3 members of the Barcelona School of Economics Scientific Council in our panel, and we have several others in our audience. Many of you also belong to Barcelona School of Economics, but I see also members of the Cercle d'Economia, so it's a nice mix. I'll make a very brief introduction of our panelists. I'll start with Richard Blundell, who is a professor at University College London, has been research director and currently co-director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and was founder of its Center for Microeconomic Analysis and Public Policy. He has been publishing widely and has a really long list of distinctions that I will skip for brevity. But I would like to emphasize 2 aspects of his impact on policy guidance. He was editor and panel member of the IFS Mirrorless Review, Tax Reform for the 21st Century, and he's currently the editor and panel member of the IFS Deaton Review on Inequality for the 21st Century. You can see that these are 2 very relevant topics where he is giving guidance for policy. I'll turn to Pinelopi Goldberg. She's professor at Yale University and affiliate of its Economic Growth Center. She also has a joint appointment at the Jackson School of Global Affairs. She was the chief economist of the World Bank for the period 2018 to 2020. She has published widely and is associated with numerous research centers and has received numerous distinctions. Her research provides insight on many topics, among them, let me list trade policies, poverty and inequality, intellectual property rights in developing countries, and also recently she has examined the resurgence of protectionism in the US, something that's very topic right now. Finally, let me introduce Preston McAfee, who is distinguished scientist at Google. He has been chief economist at Microsoft, vice president and research fellow at Yahoo Research, and chief economist at Yahoo. He has been a professor at the California Institute of Technology, University of Texas, and University of Western Ontario. He also has numerous articles and most prestigious academic journals in industrial organization and very well known in issues of auctions. He has combined this academic part with the involvement in the technology industry, and he has worked in the intersection of economics, business strategy, and computer science. Finally, I would like to introduce to you the moderator of the table, which is Andreu Mas-Colell. I think he does not need presentation. He's well known by locals, by members of the Circle, and by international academics. As you know, he's a professor at UPF, and he was also a research professor at Barcelona School of Economics. And he has countless publications and distinctions, but I think I would like to emphasize here that he's been a central actor in designing and implementing the research policy in Catalonia that has given rise to several very strong research centers and has created very handful instruments to strengthen research at the universities as well. Finally, I would emphasize that Andreu was the founder of the Barcelona School of Economics. So thanks all of you for joining us today. The title and focus of the table will be Challenges of Industrial Policy, AI, trade, and the labor market. And I'll leave the floor to Andreu now. Thank you.
So thanks, Teresa, for all your words. We are tight on time, so I go straight to the topic. The topic is well described in the title. It's not all, but a good chunk of the hot topics of the day. And we have here three distinguished speakers that roughly they fall into labor, trade, and artificial intelligence, and we'll go in that order, which is also the alphabetical order of speakers. So then we'll have 3 rounds of going round. So I start with Professor Blundell with my first question, that it would be, I read, it is commonly understood that the new realities of the technology, of the international economic order, and of between state regional inequalities profoundly affect the functioning of the labor market. Could you comment on this? Also, concern about these effects has to a large extent driven the renewed focus on industrial policy. In your view, what should a new industrial policy look like, and how would it work? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrea. Thank you. I'm going to use a few slides. I was thinking of turning the question around a little bit, starting with challenges of the labour market and why we might think of an industrial policy that could address some of those challenges. And I'm kind of used to doing this on the UK, but I thought I'd challenge myself and think about it in terms of Spain. So bear with me. I've got, now, I do have some slides, but let's, yeah. So I thought of 3 challenges that are going to lead me to why we might think of industrial policy and then what the challenge would be. Firstly, as Andreu asked about technology, so if we think of what's happened in the labour market, pretty much everywhere, and this is kind of well documented, that trade and technology have meant that the creation of new jobs have shifted kind of outward. There are kind of high professional services, technological jobs, and then kind of jobs, if you want to think of it, at the bottom. Something like a polarization of occupations, maybe not always a polarization of wages, but we do see a polarization of occupations. And I just drew this from the OECD, which are good at collecting these things. And you can see Spain here. Down is the middle skill, the one going down. The one rising up is high skill occupations, and the ones going slightly up are lower skill occupations. That's quite a challenge in the labour market. But I want to put that together with a second kind of observation that perhaps is kind of very commonly seen now, and that is the long tail of low productivity firms and a small group of high performance firms. And what's happened is that this has become increasingly geographically concentrated. It's very clear in the UK. It's pretty clear in Spain, in fact, and it creates this strong differences in productivity growth. And I drew this for Spain. You can see it's very simple. You don't really have to read it. What it says is that there's a very small group of frontier firms, top 5%, exactly the same as in the UK, which have had remarkably good productivity growth. And then the 95% of the rest, at least on average, have very poor productivity growth. What's particularly concerning, and it's going to drop me into the industrial policy line, is that there's a lot of regional concentration of this. So we see, as we know, kind of growing, thriving areas and areas that have generally low productivity firms. And in fact, if you look at this picture, which is just labour productivity growth by region in Spain, you know the regions much better than me, but I think it tells the story that the regions like Andalusia, what have you, are down on the low end. And right at the top, we get Madrid and Catalonia and what have you. So this is not surprising. It's remarkably common across countries. I could do exactly the same for the UK and many others. The third one I want to put together here is the move to just more education. So we have a large share of high educated, this is almost exactly the same as in the UK and many other European countries, but a very long tail of very poorly educated. And of course that, in a sense, is no surprise. What's the biggest shock is how geographically concentrated they have become. And you can see where I'm going, because I'm going to motivate the role for industrial policy around geography, which standard policies have been very poor at addressing. And if you look at it, I won't go, this is again across the OECD. If you look at Spain, the dark color is very low levels of education. Spain is down here, quite a high proportion with very low levels of education, but also a very large share with high levels of education. And again, we wouldn't worry so much about that, except these are very heavily geographically concentrated. And indeed, when you look at the education levels across Spain, from the best performing areas to the lowest performing areas, along those dots are all the countries, kind of developed countries, right down to Mexico and Colombia. And you can see the worst performing areas of Spain are in line with Colombia and Mexico. The best performing are right up there. And so this is kind of characterizing both the long tails but the geographical spread of it. And what this means is what it does is create left behind areas, and there are areas where children perform less well, and educated leave the area. So typically these are areas. And what's more concerning perhaps is that children from low SES background who do manage to get educated are typically the ones that stay behind. So, and I'll come back to that, because that's a big effect on social mobility. If you look at regional mobility in Spain, it's one of the lowest regional mobility countries in Europe. And so mobility isn't going to solve this, at least unless we do something about it. So this is why you think of regional things. So it creates areas with older people, not so bad, but lower educated young and low productivity firms. So we get this kind of combination. Why is that a problem? Well, there's no incentive for a firm to move in, and there's no incentive for workers to get training. Because any individual, of course, won't be able to match with a good firm. No firm will be able to find talented workers to work with unless we do something about it. And then you think about standard policies, the ones that I'm used to, tax, welfare, minimum wage, education, broad education policies. They seem to have been inadequate at addressing these challenges, and that's what motivates industrial policy. By the way, and there's a shift of preferences here. Remarkably, it's not coming out there, so I will just move on. But if you look at differences of attitudes towards redistribution and pre-distribution, there's a very nice paper by some academics, I think one at Princeton, just looking at attitudes. And among the lower educated, there's an increasing preference for pre-distribution and protection, policies that happen before taxes and benefits. Among the high educated, a strong preference for redistribution, tax. So quite a bifurcation in what policies work. The ones that the less educated work are, broadly speaking, the ones that fit in to an industrial policy strand. And that's where I'm going. If I add to that what's happened to demand for kind of for skills here, that's going to be an important aspect here. One remarkable thing is there's two types of skills that have really gone up rapidly, kind of not surprising abstract cognitive skills. The other one is social skills, almost at the same rate. There is almost, if you look uniformly across occupations that have grown, they're always a component of social skills. This is going to be another point. I hope maybe Preston will agree. But technology and social skills are quite a lot more complementary than we thought. And AI has a lot of trouble disrupting human skills and social skills. So they have two benefits, and that's where I'm going to think about. So what we're thinking of here really is an industrial policy with a mix of business entry incentives, tax, finance, antitrust, and skill development, because a firm won't move into an area like this without some idea that it can hire talent and get a good mix of workers. And likewise, a focus on tax incentives for investment and growth, not just small firms, obvious things here. But incentives for kind of agglomeration. It makes us think now about how do we build agglomerations to improve the labour market in these vast areas which have this mix of low productivity firm, low skill workers. So that's where I'm kind of going with this kind of policy challenge. And there's a lot of things we can do here, so we could talk about them, but they're very different to the kind of standard set of policies that we've been used to. They also direct us in industrial policy in very specific ways, and they tell us very obviously that just focusing on skills would not be enough. In fact, we know things go wrong there. If you introduce training and skills in one of these areas, the people who are trained don't make good matches. They get very low returns to these things, and it looks like they've been a disaster. You try and encourage firms to come in, either they bring their own talent or they won't come because there just isn't talent there. So I think what we know is some coordination of these two things is the kind of answer, at least to this challenge in the labour market. And trade policy and AI have obviously got a complementary route here, so I'm going to leave it to my colleagues here to follow up with that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Goldberg. Here I go. It is clear that the structural changes in the economic environment pose challenges for trade, growth, and development. So far, in your view, how serious are they? And how do you tentatively evaluate the induced policy changes in advanced economies?
Thanks, Andrei. In contrast to Richard and also to Preston, I don't have slides. And that's partly because of the format of this event, but it's also partly because I wanted to have the flexibility to react to the news of this morning, which brings me to my first point. One of the biggest challenges we face today, actually since February, is the fact that uncertainty has increased to unprecedented levels. And this poses a challenge for everyone. It poses a challenge for policymakers, but it also poses challenges for industrial policy. When we judge industrial policy, just to give you one example, in the new budget of the United States, many of the tax credits for electric vehicles were rolled back. So when you try to judge the effectiveness of industrial policy in the United States or debate the question, how should Europe respond to this industrial policy, you have to face the fact that this industrial policy in the US no longer exists. So this increased uncertainty is one of the defining features of this new environment. That said, I think the last 10 days have been relatively calm. So I will take advantage of that to just focus on some of the long-run issues. So some of these developments that unfold slowly in the long run and are perhaps more seriously. And I think perhaps one of the biggest costs of this uncertainty is, rather than focusing on these issues, and Richard touched on many of them, we are focused on what is going to happen on the next day. So what are these big challenges that Andreu asked me about? So first, I would say there are some structural changes, and by that I mean primarily new technologies, starting with automation, so the replacement of people, of workers by robots and machines, and then digitalization, and more recently AI. And I won't have anything to say about AI simply because it's too recent and it's mostly speculation. So as Jeffrey Hinton put it, looking into AI is like looking into fog. You know what's right in front of you and you don't know what's in the distance. So I don't think we can say anything intelligent about it yet, about how it's going to affect the economy and how it's going to affect us. But we have a lot of information, a lot of evidence from automation and digitalization. And there the evidence is very mixed, as you would expect. With almost every new technology, there are many promises and there are also many risks. And so what we know from the evidence to date is that in some cases, these new technologies led to big productivity improvements and growth and development, and in some cases, they didn't. So to give you an example from the area that I know best, that I know the most about, trade, The main concern with trade was that automation would lead to massive reshoring. It would bring economic activity back to the home countries because there would be no reason for companies or for countries to trade with countries that had low wages and produced goods there at lower cost. It turns out that was not necessarily the case, and the reason is there are two effects. There is a productivity effect, a scale effect. So as you introduce new technologies, firms become more productive. They scale their operations, and that may create more demand for inputs from other countries that take labor to produce. So that's one effect, and then there is the second effect that everyone worries about, the labor displacement effect. And if you look at the studies to date, in some cases the first effect dominates, in some cases the second effect dominates, but it hasn't been gloom and doom as many people expected. Now, one finding of all studies is there hasn't been reshoring, so it's not that companies brought activities back, but what happened in many cases was that the patterns of trade changed, so the countries that benefited the most from these new technologies were countries that had the skills to take advantage of them, or had the capital necessary to produce, to take advantage of these new technologies. And that brings me to the point that also Richard mentioned, that there is demand for higher skills, for more education across the board, across all countries. And the question is how we get there. This is particularly a challenge for low-income countries, for many countries where human capital is still very low. I would think this is not an issue in European countries where the educational level is already very high, so we are well positioned to take advantage of these new technologies. A different challenge, though, I think, that we talk less about is that even though machines may replace people in many important tasks, actually doing tasks that are quite unpleasant that most of us would not like to do, there are still many jobs that need to be done by humans and no one wants to do. And these tend to be low-end jobs that require little or no skill, and people in advanced economies no longer want to do. And so what are these jobs? Take healthcare, taking care of the elderly, cleaning the streets, collecting the dishes in a restaurant, doing the dishes, working in the kitchen, all cleaning gardens or doing the landscaping, or not to mention in agriculture, picking fruit or picking strawberries. So really unpleasant, tough jobs that still need to be done by humans, and people in advanced countries no longer want to do them. And there the only solution I see is a different kind of immigration policy. I won't call it industrial policy. I think of industrial policy mostly as policy targeting specific sectors of the economy. But educational policy or immigration policy are broad-based policies that are going to be important if we want to take advantage of these new technologies. Another big structural change is, of course, climate change. And climate change, I think of this mostly as a phenomenon that, among other things, is going to change patterns of comparative advantage across countries. This is, again, something we worried a lot about, but to date, the effects have not been as dramatic as people have expected them. On the other hand, I would argue that the policy changes have been much more dramatic, and they've had very strong, very important short-term effects for all countries, but particularly for small countries and particularly for middle-income and low-income countries. And by policy changes, I mean the general change in attitudes towards markets, towards trade, towards economic efficiency. During this era that we call hyperglobalization, all countries put economic efficiency ahead of national security. So this has changed. So now national security comes first and economic efficiency second. The problem with national security, I'm not saying that this is not important, but it's not something we can verify. It's one way to shut down the debate. If you object to a particular kind of industrial policy, the government can always say, we really need this because of national security reasons, and that's the end of the debate. So I think we need to be a little bit careful when we invoke the national security argument. In addition, there has been return to protectionism, the rise of economic nationalism, the waning of multilateralism. So it's a very different economic environment than in the past. And that poses significant challenges for all countries. Among these challenges is also the return of industrial policy. And when I say return, I mean the revival of old-style industrial policies that targeted manufacturing or targeted specific sectors of the economy, because industrial policy of the kind that supports research and development has always been there in all countries, including advanced countries. And so this, again, is viewed with mixed feelings by many countries, because it's viewed by many as a departure from the multilateral spirit, and that applies both to low-income countries, but it also applies to European countries that have viewed this as a betrayal of the principles that the United States and the European Union and many other advanced countries used to stand for. And in addition to that, we of course have the geopolitics, the change in the geopolitical environment, the trade war, the economic war between the US and China. Many think that perhaps this is the true reason of all the major changes. And this economic rivalry between the US and China has come to dominate not just the news, but every decision that's made in the economic policy domain. And among other things, industrial policy in the US and sometimes also in Europe is viewed as a response to the industrial policy that China has pursued in the past. And I won't talk about this because I know Preston has a lot to say about that. But to conclude, in my opinion, the policy changes have been much more important in the last few years than the structural changes. They've got dramatic effects on economic policy and perhaps also on economic outcomes. And the silver lining here is that policy is up to us. So it's up to policymakers and up to countries to change. These structural changes perhaps less so. I'll stop here.
Professor McAfee.
Okay, so even though I'm not between these two speakers, I'm going to be speaking between them in the sense of I only have a couple of slides, but not zero, and my remarks are in between as well, as you will in a moment see. Let's see if I can advance. Oh, that works great. The first thing I want to talk about, a fair number of economists say that are opposed to industrial policy, say it doesn't work. And there certainly have been some instances where it didn't. For example, Japan told Honda not to export cars because it wanted to concentrate on Toyota and Nissan. And that was a terrible mistake because Honda actually did better than Nissan in the end. The Made in China plan, Made in China 2025 was the name of it, and it was initiated in 2015. And this seems to me to be one of the most astute industrial policies that's been made. Let me just review the plan. So it involved 10 industries. It's always 10 because we have 10 toes. Information technology, which at the time didn't involve AI, but now does. Robots, green energy and vehicles, aerospace, ocean engineering, rail, electric power, but especially electric power, materials and material science, medicine, and agriculture. So there are a few entries on this list, like agriculture, that you might not have predicted great advances in, although the ability to do Internet of Things on agriculture, so the idea that you put sensors around so that you know when weeds are growing or when things need to be watered, can actually get you large percentage increases in agricultural output with way fewer chemicals. This is something that we're going to see a lot of in the next decade. So even though that was kind of a sleepy industry relative to this list, it was also sort of critical for China specifically because they have 1.4 billion people. Dwindling though. But with the rest of those, it was pretty predictable that these are going to matter. These are growth areas for the next decade, and sure enough, they were. The evaluations of this have so how did the world react? The EU predictably published a report. Japan actually increased its high-tech, it focused on and increased high-tech exports. That was a reasonably smart move. Taiwan and the US have suffered a significant brain drain of his heritage Chinese people, but nonetheless, the smart people that Richard talked about. And then the U.S. Predictably imposed sanctions, which doesn't actually deal with the issue. Most of the people who know better, Pinelopi would be one, who know better than I do about how to evaluate these policies, say mostly a success. That is to say, in something like 5 of the 10 sectors, they've done very well. In 3, they seem not to have done so well, and in 2, they're kind of, it's too early to tell, but overall, reasonable success. I think that what underlies smart industrial policy, and that Richard actually referred to this, is complementarities. So you want to do policies where if you can get this piece of the action going, other stuff will follow. And I agree on his description of it. I agree on part of his description of industrial policy, at least with regards to further development. I'm not as confident that focused on the geographically left behind is going to work. Nothing seems to have worked in the past, and it is really hard to get all the pieces right when you have none of the pieces to start with. One thing all right, so on regulation, if you're trying to build new sectors, one of the things you want to do, you want to have the ability to fail at 2 different levels. One is you want your firms to be able to fail. And that is the major difference between the United States and Europe, is that I can start a firm with 4 people in the United States, go raise some venture capital, subcontract, use the venture capital to subcontract all of the services I don't know how to do, like legal services, who files the patents on the inventions, accounting services, tax services, HR services. I get my cloud services so that I can operate without having any physical assets whatsoever. I rent space at WeWork. You take all that, and then if it doesn't work, which it doesn't more than half the time, you fail. The venture capitalists are out the money. They were licensed to take those risks. That is to say, they had signed statements that said they had adequate capital, that this wasn't going to bankrupt them. And the firm's gone. The people are out of their jobs. There are only 4 of them. It doesn't really matter that much in the grand scheme of things. This is how you produce the Magnificent Seven. And this is something that's very hard to do in Europe, primarily because you're not allowed to fire your employees when you fail. And that's something I would just fix. That is to say, regulation number 1 is that I can sign a statement that says I don't have employment rights. And only those people get hired by the firm, and that's fine. The people who don't want to work for that firm can go work for Airbus. And maybe that goes away when you reach 100 employees. By the way, you're going to have a whole lot of firms with exactly 100 employees if that happens. But that's okay. We have a lot of, like every timber mill in the United States has 500 employees or less, because then they qualify for small business protections. And 501, they don't. So you don't see any until you get to like 20,000 is the next thing. All right, so that's one thing I would do, is make it possible to fail. But the second thing I would make it possible to do is have the regulation fail. And let me give my poster child for this, is GDPR, which has kind of wrecked the web. I was asked about this, and I publicly spoke before GDPR, and I thought, this is an interesting experiment. It might work. But it didn't. Instead, we get a bunch of pop-ups that all we do is say yes to. I don't know about you. I personally run a thing that deletes all my cookies every 15 minutes, but it didn't actually solve the problem it was made to solve. Okay, so scrap it. Don't say it's good, because it isn't. It didn't work. But try something else. But this is, a more flexible regulatory framework is also necessary. And this is not to say that the United States has it. my final remark is, so China's done something really smart. This is the Made in China 2015, or 2025 is the name of it. It was done in 2015. That was really smart. It was worth emulating. It was worth copying and saying, we're going to focus on industrial areas. These are the ones that we're going to focus on. The United States has, for whatever reason, decided to shoot itself in the head. Right? We've gone to war with our own university system. The university system is the foundation of our tech development. So now, EU already taking advantage of it. France has set aside a bunch of money, bring in academics, Spain to a lesser extent. That's really smart. I would amp that thing up 100x. I have a friend who's transgender, a university professor, and he's ready to move because the U.S., he's got the double whammy. He's at an Ivy League school and he's transgender. This is a moment in opportunity. The United States has benefited from the brain drain for 75 years. We've outperformed the rest of the world because of it. This is the moment to grab those people. China, they're doing everything, or most things right, but they also have a dictatorship. Sooner or later, China gets Stalin, their version of Stalin, who executed the astronomers because of some crazy communist thing. That's the moment in which Europe becomes the dominant area in the world. And I would not worry about competing with China because its government is its own enemy. Finally, Pinelopi said that no one can say anything intelligent about AI. So thank you. The thing about AI is it's not just LLMs. LLMs do a bunch of interesting things. They are going to, if your kids read graphic novels, or you personally, maybe you're younger than I am, read graphic novels, they're going to be written by AI. It's just the right technology for the job. It's very clever, right? But AI, that's not the only AI. And the most important AI development to date, I think, is actually protein folding. That was not generated with an LLM. It was adversarial network generated it, but it was not an LLM. There's a lot of scope for other kinds of AI besides LLMs. And I think LLMs are going to do some pretty amazing things. So the average survival, this is a US statistic, when one of a couple dies, the spouse lives on average 11 more years. The meme is they die right away, but that isn't the truth. The truth is they live 11 more years and they're lonely for that 11 years. AI is their friend. And I'm going to leave you with, my prediction is that 10 years from now, a majority of the developed world will say their best friend is an AI. Because AI is available when you're having a crisis in the middle of the night.
Thank you very much. Let me say that the speakers are so disciplined that they have taken less than the time allotted, and also they have consumed everything they wanted to say in the first and the second round. So instead of making the questions of the second round, which are overlapping, I will say a few things to each of you, but basically you can discuss and comment on each other. In the case of Professor Blundell, or should I say Sir Richard Blundell?
Richard is fine.
The issue was, could you comment more on the education, and in general, in connecting with the regional, you told us what should be done, but has it been done somewhere? Other good experiences? There are some models, or as he suggested, the matter is hopeless. And to Professor Goldberg, I was suggesting a more short-term question. What do you think all the disruption, all the sound and fury that comes from the Trump administration will mean in 1 year time. Professor McAfee, well, the second round was, do we have an opportunity to move the locus of innovation from the US to Europe? And you answered already yes, but maybe you can regale our ears a bit more with what we should do, and we probably won't. So why don't you start now, Professor Goldberg?
Regarding where we're going to be in 1 year, given the disruptions, I have no idea. Since January, I'm constantly asked to comment on the new trade policy, and I cannot comment because I don't know what the trade policy is. It changes all the time, and I think that one thing that's for sure is that companies and countries are not going to make the long-term investments they usually undertake when they operate under a predictable set of rules, and this is lost for good. If I may, I just wanted to briefly comment on Preston and his view on Europe catching up with the US and China. Of course, we all wish that, and to a certain extent, I had the same thought. I was a little uncomfortable as a US citizen sharing that with everyone, that this is a great opportunity for Europe to grab talent that wants to leave the US. On the other hand, I think that there are policies that China pursued that cannot easily be imitated by other countries. People look at China and they say they were so successful, let's do the same. It's not clear that what worked for China is going to work for other countries. And just to give you one example, there are two sectors I've studied in great detail: electric vehicles and semiconductors. In electric vehicles, China dominates the world market. In semiconductors, I would argue that they're not at the frontier. The claim is they're catching up. But despite the fact that they identify that as an important sector, they report millions of dollars, they haven't managed to catch up. And so if you ask why not, one hypothesis is that in semiconductors, they didn't have the bargaining power they used in many other industries to induce companies to share their technology. So I think industrial policy is important, but when you're a follower, when you're not the leader in new technologies, you need to learn from the leaders. And in the past, when we had this open trading environment, I mean, I'm not talking here about free trade, but we embrace the idea that we can all learn from each other and do business with each other, no matter what the regime is. So in that regime, China benefited from learning from other countries and benefiting from the progress they had made in many sectors. The US has decided to cut this off with the recent export controls. Why is this relevant to Europe? I think Europe can catch up only to the extent that companies or leaders in other countries, mainly the US, will allow them to have access to these new technologies. Starting from zero is very hard, when we're talking about these new industries. And to me, it's not clear that this is going to happen in this new environment where countries are very much focused on economic nationalism.
So,
interpolated,
So first, I fully agree that you don't want to copy China, especially you don't want to copy their government. Because I think the law, a dictator could do a lot of good things. A benevolent dictator was Plato's optimal government. But the key word there is benevolent. And dictators eventually aren't benevolent. Is, I think, predictable based on history is so as a consequence, the United States can't copy China's rail policy because we're not going to just like tear down people's homes willy-nilly, which they were willing to do to build a high-speed rail. That doesn't mean you can't copy the thing to be after. The jewel of the United States is Silicon Valley, is that innovation engine that produced the Magnificent Seven, that generates all of this new wealth. That's something that Europe can copy. And I don't know that copy is even the right word, but you can, that could move from the United States to Europe. Now, I don't mean this is easy. And in fact, the one proof that it's not easy is that Silicon Valley itself has real estate that's about, well, it's the most expensive real estate in the United States. It has the highest taxes in the United States, or the people pay the highest taxes, and the overall cost of labor is very high there. And yet still, that's where most of the tech startups are, and they're there because the venture capitalists are there, and the venture capitalists are there because all the tech startups are there. So you got to break that complementarity, that virtuous cycle. And the key to this, it all got started way back when with Hewlett-Packard with the universities. And that's the giant vulnerability, is that you bring the universities. The other thing I would say is kind of not without this. You have to be able to fail. You have to be able to have a startup that tries something and fails. And that is, your policies have to allow that. And today that's much harder because you got to deal with all the labor regulations, even if you're a 4-person startup. And that's the thing that you need to actually engineer around. Now, there are a lot of other things the government can do, innovation, what do you call those areas where the people innovate? You can supply, infrastructure for innovation around, built around your universities. But I would say the things that will happen kind of automatically is if you have the people inventing the new technologies, which you've got a great labor force for that, better than the United States. By the way, an underappreciated advantage is national health. In the U.S., the firm has to pay for health care, and that's, of course they hire 20-year-olds where health care isn't much of an issue. But here, you can actually hire employees and have their health care is already covered. And so that makes it a lot easier to start a firm, because I don't have to worry if I go work for this startup that's probably going to fail, that I'm not going to have health care. And in the U.S., I got to worry about that. And so that's an advantage.
Thanks.
One thing, so I'll take you up on the geography point. The idea, is to try and recreate Silicon Valley, or London for that matter, outside London. And I'm not talking about areas with just small areas of the population with a few people, not the deaths of despair. I'm talking about half the population. In most European countries, certainly the UK, you'll find areas which do have half the population, which is a kind of productivity desert. But there are university towns, great ones nearby, so it's kind of capturing those two things together and getting to work. Turns out that it's much harder, as you pointed out, it's much harder than we thought. But you kind of see how it could work. And I kind of add to that, the problem with democracy is that you do have to worry about people in those areas. And we know the kind of upset with democracy over the last 10 years is more or less completely driven by what I was describing, vast areas with very little social mobility, where people who do get educated either leave or can't find an appropriate match for that education. And I think that's my view at that is a coordination problem. It's a really hard one, but we do have successes, and we kind of have to learn how to make them work. The UK is interesting. We used to have 5 cities in the top 50 in Europe. Now we only have 1, and that's London. So, things have gone in the wrong direction, and you kind of have to figure out why. And it's had a huge political outcome. But also, in terms of overall productivity, there comes a point you can't just rely on Silicon Valley for the whole of a large population. So I think you're right. The challenge is, how do we get the replicants of those? How do we design a coordination policy that makes that work? I would kind of add one thing that we do very poorly, Spain does pretty poorly, and that's how we treat those who don't go to university. And there are countries, especially Scandinavia, Germany, that do this much better. It's a small point, but it's kind of important that the kind of routes through to successful careers and that for people who don't go to university can be designed in a way that can somewhat complement new technologies. And that's a potentially exciting way to think through. That isn't happening at the moment. And you can see it in Spain, you can see it in the UK. There are economies where that's done better. I don't think China's doing that better, by the way. China has a vast poor population, and that's just a different environment. And so I think the kind of politics of democracy plus all this kind of unused resource, in a sense, it just opens the question, how do we get that to work? An increase in education and kind of welfare hasn't done it. So somehow it has to be kind of more focused, is what I would say. It's a hard challenge, though.
Is there anywhere where it's done right?
I mean, I used to say Germany did it much better, and the reason is that the link between work and education was much closer, so that in all the different areas there would be successful firms where you could work and you wouldn't leave the area. And indeed, there's somewhat of that. It's a much more equally spread, and there are successes. The only problem is you know, you have to do that while also encouraging new technologies. And I guess to some extent, the slowdown in Germany is a reflection of not being at the frontier in picking up new technologies. But some of the points about being able to spread the complementarities between different people in the production process has been more successful. It hasn't been that successful in the US.
Yeah, actually, Kansas City is a city in the United States that has, so what Kansas City did is they started this entrepreneurial program where first they made sure that you could get gigabit fiber when gigabit fiber was not that common in the United States. And then second, they had like $20,000 if you would just come there and start a business. They had a subsidy for coming and starting a business, and a whole bunch of what are digital nomads, people who work remotely, moved to Kansas City because it was actually a pretty good place. The cost of living is low, schools are okay. This, by the way, you know, one of the negative virtuous cycle, whatever that's called, the destructive cycle, is the educated people move, the schools get worse, because educated people really care about, you know, they work as a positive force in the schools themselves, and then now the system has gotten even more desperate. So this has had a pretty major benefit. And then the other one that seems to be working, and it's really kind of surprising, is Detroit. So Detroit has become a tech sector primarily based on the fact, or has a burgeoning tech sector, primarily based on there was a lot of available real estate. And so you could build things. So their focus, and I think, you know, one of the things is that trade has taught us is the technological ladder. If you want to get better, start with something you can do and make that better, and just, you know, step by step. And that's where, so Detroit is starting kind of on a low end of the ladder, building devices, but then stuff, you know, like Internet of Things kind of devices, although watches too, weirdly. And then, but they're now moving up, and there was a labor force there, you know, left over from the automobile industry that was the base for this. And so, but I make those to be, everyone's going to be different. That is to say, you're not going to have a policy that says this is how we're going to get our the Edinburghs of the world. This is how we're going to develop them, because if you do that, they're all going to be competing with each other. They all have to differentiate, and I don't know how you do that as a policy. But you might.
I was actually about to comment on this. So one other thing trade has taught us, or I would say that's one of the main insights of traditional trade, is that trade and economic welfare are not necessarily a zero-sum game. And that was the thinking that prevailed in the past decades. That was the cornerstone of our whole economic system. And that also applies to development within countries when we talk about these place-based policies. One of the concerns is you have crowding out. You cannot have 10 Silicon Valleys. You need to differentiate. And you know, in the past, at least, we accepted this notion that we are not in a zero-sum game when we considered relations across countries. So one of my main concerns is this is gone for good. Now everything is considered to be a fight against another country, definitely against China, but now, in the US, also vis-a-vis Europe, Canada, Australia, every other country. And when you're in this mindset, this poses completely new challenges that we are not prepared to deal with. At least, those of us who grew up in the previous decades were not in this mindset where we view every other country or every other location as a potential rival.
Very good. I propose the following. We have time, so I will open for questions, and then at the end you will do a wrap-up. Questions, I'll pray that they be questions. So that they will be brief and a question, and then we'll get the answers. So, nobody dares? Please go ahead. Yes,
Okay, so,
Martin.
well, thank you all for the presentation. So I wanted to ask you a question because, I'm from Latin America originally, where we tried a lot of these industrial policies and they failed miserably. So what makes you think that we can now be different? That the government or a bureaucrat will have the information or the knowledge to do this in a benign fashion? Thank you.
So,
I think you have the most expertise of the panel, but I'm happy to opine, even though I don't have the most expertise.
Go ahead.
I can start, but so first, there's no guarantee that industrial policy will succeed. There are many failures, but there are also many failures in the private sector, right? I mean, most of the startups fail, and some of them succeed and do great. And so, of course, the argument against industrial policy is you don't want to be experimenting with the taxpayers' money, right? That's the big problem. And also, you have a moral hazard issue. If there's nothing at stake, then you take risks that a firm in the private sector would not. So these are usually the arguments, but actually these arguments, if you think about it, don't quite apply because we end up bailing out firms that fail in the private sector as well. So I think sometimes people judge things that happen in the public sector, in the government sector very differently from policies that are pursued by the private sector with very similar results. That said, I think we should think very carefully about what makes an industrial policy successful and what does not. And I very much believe we should approach this question with an open mind. I mean, I very much agree with what Preston said, that you have to tailor the industrial policy to the country, to the setting, to the sector. It's not one size fits all. But we shouldn't be dogmatic about it and reject industrial policy out of hand. Again, I would be very cautious not to just import the kind of policies that China implemented, because the political regime is very different in China, the setting is very different. What worked there is not going to work necessarily for a country in Latin America. But but I think there is one lesson we can learn from China, and this is something that the Chinese emphasize, that they start small, they see what works, and if it works, they scale up. So rather than going for these big push policies that have a good chance of failing, start small, try to evaluate the policy. If it's not successful, stop it. One of the issues with industrial policy in the US, and I think also in Latin America, is the policy is not successful, but you keep it alive because there is a lot of lobbying in the meantime. If the policy does not appear to be successful, kill it. But if it appears to be successful, then scale it up. So I think there is what the Chinese call cross the river by filling the stones. I think this is a very wise piece of advice. So I think this is something we can learn from China.
And I would add to that, my read of the literature is that industrial policy sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. On balance, probably mostly has worked. That is, it's mostly been advantageous. If you specialize to, these are industrial policies that encouraged industries, think U.S. and railroads. The U.S. had an industrial policy to encourage railroads. That actually opened up giant markets within the United States by bringing, Kansas grain to the east. That was wildly successful. Then there are also policies that aren't, but that's one where it's complementary to other industries and other technologies. And that's I think the key thing that you want your industrial policy. The U.S. had a long time of telling developing nations that they should build steel industries and so on, and all that did is make them compete with each other. That was terrible policy because it wasn't actually emphasizing or creating a provision of services that had complements to other industries and made those industries work better. In contrast, electrification was wildly successful, at least within the United States, because it actually encouraged made possible all sorts of other things. So I do think, and as Pinelopi says, the policies that are then captured by locals, that's usually a recipe for failure. You do need good government to make this work. It's just not going to work, and you can never fail fast with bad government, and that's a problem.
Jordi?
Do I use a mic or?
Yes, use the mic.
Yes, thank you. And thanks to the speakers. I have a question for Preston McAfee. You said, that, and I sympathize with the point that we should eliminate regulations that do not work, and you mentioned GDPR. And my direct and short question is, what do you think of the Digital Markets Act, which tries to define gatekeeper platforms? Will this work? Do you like it?
Yeah, let me make clear that I definitely am not speaking for Google on this. Google has a well-defined notion of what it thinks of that act, I'm unfortunately more ignorant than I wish I was about Europe. The parallel in the United States, we had laws proposed and even passed that condition on the size of firms. That is to say, it matters how big the firm is, whether this is, and I don't mean like 100 people, I mean 45% market share, 600 billion in equity. Where the equity value should ever matter is completely opaque to me. Because either it's anti-competitive or it's not. And we already had laws against anti-competitive behavior. I don't actually see the need. So I guess one thing I didn't like about the DMA is just its conditioning on size, as opposed to economic impact or prices. Actually, the U.S. law mostly revolves around, is this good for consumers? That seems like the relevant question to me. And that isn't the gatekeeper question. But again, I'm not an expert on this at all. And moreover, I'm not even supposed to talk about it. So
We haven't heard anything.
Yeah, good.
Miquel.
I want to follow up on the
So people in the back can hear.
Well, first of all, thank you for the excellent panel. I wanted to follow up on the industrial policy question. And my question is very simple. I mean, do you think that technology is something, the use of technology by governments that may allow them to have more information in order to really design more targeted policies or to identify complements, as you were suggesting? Would this be an argument that would or would it be an issue that would make the argument for industrial policy today stronger than in the past? Do you think technology is something that is relevant in the design of industrial policy?
I'm happy to take a first stab at this. Can you remind me of the Dartmouth professor who studies the history of technology? Do you know who I'm talking about?
Doug Irwin? History of trade, not Doug.
Not trade, technological implementation. I'm blanking on his name. Dartmouth professor, we'll come up with his name as soon as I quit speaking. And he looked at the history of technological adoption. And just to give us a European example, so Austria adopted telephony and and things like that much faster than what is now Hungary. And he estimates that this gave Austria an 80-year advantage. That is, the half-life was 80 years of the advantage. So overall, Diego Komen, that's his name, overall, his estimates, and this is a worldwide, he looks at every, all countries. The half-life of technology, that is the advantage that it accrues to adopt technology earlier, is very large and very permanent. So I think the first thing I want to say is absolutely, and moreover, you got to figure that, identifying who needs help, where services are important, or even something as simple as making the traffic lights coordinated so that people spend less time in cars, those sorts of, and when the trains should run, those sorts of things become just much better with technology. And I think that's like wildly important. Now, there's also the abuse side, right? Is that this is going to undo the ability to be, to do things out of sight very rapidly. Some of that's good, right? Is we're catching a lot of criminals from from their Google searches. That strikes me as purely a good thing. But where where the government then uses that power to make sure that it gets reelected, that becomes a really bad thing. And so I don't know how to deal with that. With that aspect of it. But overall, I think a whole bunch of provision of city services just gets better with IoT, with Internet of Things.
And I would just add, this is where history matters, because different countries have very different sensitivities when it comes to these issues. In Germany, for example, people are very sensitive to privacy concerns for understandable reasons. In Scandinavian countries, they trust the government.
Okay.
In the United States, we tend to be cautious.
Actually, if I can add to that, there was this wonderful study that offered you a euro or a adjusted pound if you would give your telephone number after buying something online. And so they would just give you a euro off for that. And Germans were twice as likely as Britons to give their phone number over to this sketchy service that was selling them candy that they had no knowledge of who it was. And it's because, I believe, the Germans have a regulatory environment that limits the abuse in the way that Britain doesn't. And that's why they were more willing. But in fact, they sure didn't seem to worry about their privacy as much as the Britons did, based on this, their revealed preference.
Okay, I cannot resist mentioning that Diego Comín is a graduate of one of the BSE institutions.
That's great research.
Yes.
Thanks. So I think on one hand, there was a discussion on one hand, there was a discussion on how to get to the technological frontier in Europe, no? And I think, Preston, you talked more about this. And Sir Richard, you talked more about these left behind areas, like, I imagine you have like Bradford or a place like Tortosa here in mind, that it's, aged populations, low-skilled workers stay there. I think probably we need very different industrial policies for these two problems. And I wanted to ask a bit, which one you think we would be more successful in tackling, in which one would, and then the other is which level of government should focus on each problem, no? Because we have regional, national, and the supranational, the EU, and if there was some level of government that you thought would be more successful for tackling one kind or the other. Sorry.
Okay, I can just I wasn't really thinking of Bradford, although that's a difficult case. That fits Preston's. That's going to be hard. I'm thinking of Manchester. Manchester used to be in the top 5. It's not any longer. It has what appears to be everything that should make it work, but it doesn't. And I think my view is that the way policy should go is not kind of choosing things, but making sure we kind of understand, Preston put his finger on it really, what kinds of talent gets together to make things work. And it seems awfully obvious, but at universities you don't learn about entrepreneurship or scaling up. And it turns out they're quite different things. And somewhere like London, maybe Kansas now, has the combination of those, but you can get quite successful, apparently successful towns with universities that somehow doesn't have that kind of mix right. And I think that's where it's a kind of difficult thing to get right, but I think you can set up a set of incentives to get those things working together. It might be venture capital, it might be some entrepreneurial abilities and the talent in universities. And some places they seem to work extremely well. I think we're beginning to understand how, and I think policy can go for that. It doesn't have to choose what comes out of that. It has to get incentives right to get the set of complements together. And I think the examples you gave were great. Bradford kind of case is more about, is really that whole problem of what can we do for those in the bottom third, really, when the whole town is like that. And, you know, what could be done there. I think there are things we can do, but they're much more challenging. The kind of vocational things we do right now are not very successful at all. I'll go on about that. But I'm thinking of mid-success areas which should be highly productive and somehow are not. And I think we just don't, policy doesn't seem to recognize the types of complements that work. So that would be my push for where industrial policy should be thinking, not about picking winners or even choosing technologies actually, but just getting the right things together.
One thing that's worth adding to this discussion is that it is likely that education is going to change dramatically in the next decade based on LLMs. The hallucination problem is, it looks like the hallucination problem will be solved. And the solution is interesting for LLMs. The solution is interesting because it's running an adversarial network whose task the task it's given is to identify hallucinations. And the thing is it's pretty easy to actually train that thing to find hallucinations, that is unsupported statements. And it gets scored a positive point when that happens, and then you maximize the points. And then you run the two systems together, and what you get out of it is even when the LLM does hallucinate, it gets caught by the adversary. And so it never gets out to the person. But in the background, you have these two systems fighting with each other is how they operate. Not that the LLM is incented to hallucinate, it's just not sufficiently incented not to, and then we solve the hallucinations. Once you can solve the hallucinations, you can turn around and give individual education. So the dream of having, you know, the teacher, the expert teacher who knows you and teaches to your level. If you've read the book The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, it has a really wonderful description of how this might work. That dream, maybe we may have that dream in the next decade. And if so, this becomes a whole new avenue of bringing people up, where we actually give them the education that gets them to their full potential.
So I think the problem with this argument is there are already incredible resources out there on the internet if you want to get an education. The problem is you have to know what you want, and you have to know what you need to do. But this is a big if. You know, this is half the way to actually getting an education. If you know you need an education, then you are halfway there. And the problem is in these areas that Richard is talking about, people don't even realize how important this is. So to come back to your question, I think what the previous administration, the previous US administration, the Biden administration tried to do is combine different kinds of industrial policy. So for example, pursue industrial policy for employment reasons or climate change, electric vehicles, tax credits for electric vehicles, but try to place the plants, the associated industry in places that face challenges, so that these places benefit, that these places get the good jobs. And the many of these policies were criticized as policies that were pursuing multiple objectives at the same time, and this was viewed as being counterproductive. So it's very hard to combine these different objectives in one policy and still be successful, simply because companies want to go where the talent already is. They don't want to help develop this talent, which had been the vision originally of the administration. But to come back to why the kind of policies that Richard is talking about are so important, many would claim, I wouldn't say this is the only reason, but perhaps one of the reasons that we see this backlash against the successes of the past. Everything, by many metrics, the previous decades up to 2015 were incredibly successful. We saw rapid growth, poverty reduction across the world, and yet we see the entire world revolting against that. Why is that? So part of the reason could be that you have these regions within countries, especially advanced countries, that were left behind, and people revolted against the success of others. And so part of the reason that we need to take care of these areas is if we want to maintain all the successes that we've had in the past and pursue these policies that we all view as very promising for the future.
Thank you.
Yes, so I was wondering about further examples of industrial policy beyond infrastructure, because some cases you have mentioned maybe tax credits, you mentioned also starting small, but how to implement this into practice is the main challenge. And also, in case that's not enough, also it would be nice to see how we reconcile with competition, because the equilibrium between subsidies and competition is very delicate. Thank you.
Well, a couple of quick reactions. It's kind of interesting, in lots of areas that don't do very well, they also have a lot of entry barriers, by the way, even for small companies, not just regulation, just the way it works. And I think that entry is super important here in that. The other thing I would say is that lots of industrial kind of policy, at least that I've seen, kind of says if we move one thing here, it has a major effect, without realizing why talented people get together in a place. There's a kind of set of opportunities. So you kind of want to move that's the idea of a cluster, of course, especially around a university. And so I think that idea that what generates kind of successful innovation is people having the opportunity to fail, but also to move around, and for their, so having a set of alternatives, which of course means you can't do this everywhere. You have to, it's going to be, the choice is, Kansas or somewhere. But it's, I think the nature of what draws talent and what makes it success is quite interesting. And you still see governments I'll put one government department here, and you realize that won't attract talent, because those people want other opportunities and a whole cluster of things there. So I think understanding what kind of draws talent and how talent becomes, generates this successful environment for business startup and growth, I think is still something we could learn more. And I think government can have a huge role there, because no single firm will go into these areas. You've got to have some kind of cluster incentive. But they're obvious points, but I think it's a great question.
So I would add, I think it takes trial and error. So it takes a case-by-case approach in industrial policy. But if I put my trade economist hat on, I would add that countries need to also be aware of their comparative advantage. So I think countries like the US and also European countries have subsidized heavily in the past. They have pursued industrial policy, but a very different kind of industrial policy than the ones pursued in Asian countries, for example. The industrial policy in the US was called DARPA. It was the defense industry, right? And essentially it promoted research, including research in universities. And the US has been very good at that. Fund research and then let the unregulated private sector run with it. Europe has also funded research very heavily. It's much more regulating than the US. Asia has employed, most Asian countries have employed a very different mix. And as I said before, I don't think that one can copy policies that were used in other countries, but one has to be aware of what works for my own country.
Okay, I think we should wrap up. I have one question, but do just take the wrap-up remarks you want to make. My question is, how do you see the future of the relationships between the US and the European Union? I, for one, understand that many people in the US may be resentful that Europe in general, NATO countries, are free ride in terms of security. But that's the only thing that I understand. For the rest, the hostility of the US to the European Union seems to me a puzzle. I don't know if it has deep roots or it's something of Trump. And of course, that's important to anticipate the future. How do you see that? But we make the final turn, so don't feel constrained to that question.
You're asking a Brit about our feelings between the US and
well, we are from Britain, which
yeah,
is
know,
somewhere in the middle,
that's right.
in this. I am a sort of puzzled that Iberia will end up running with Boeings because of an agreement between Britain and the United States.
Exactly.
And we will not be buying Airbus, but Boeing. Okay, continue.
What? No, I mean, one thing, of course, Britain's jealous of is the size of the market. We've realized market size matters a lot in developing lots of things, including technology, and I think that's something that's being relearned, and you can see it happening. And in a way, that I would also kind of end on that idea, the importance of kind of market size and these kind of cluster things is super important. And I always thought that work from home and technology would change this, but it's remarkably stubborn. So this kind of the market you're in and the talent around it is super important. So the success of being able to bring people in and out is very important, to use technology and to sell in the market. And that's the lesson we learn. Policy seems to be going in the opposite direction to that, and I kind of worry about that kind of inward-looking policy. It's different from the way I was thinking, but that matters a lot.
Well, I have double citizenship, US and Greek. so I think I can approach this question in a fairly objective way. So I think there is a widespread feeling in the US that Europe has been free riding the US, on the US. So not just in national security, but in everything. So for the past decades, the US has been the center of innovation, and Europe has benefited enormously from this innovation. Everyone here uses Google, the internet, and all the other products that come with it, and at the same time, they criticize them very sharply. And so there is this antagonism there. At the same time, when it comes to national security, right now there is, especially in Northern Europe, there is great optimism about Europe getting its act together. In Germany, they removed the debt brake, and this is viewed as a new step towards Europe asserting its position again and becoming a power in world markets once again. I'm a little concerned about doing that in the context of national security, of using military expenditures as a growth strategy. I mean, whenever this happened, we ended up with a war. And so on one hand, I think it's very important for Europe to use the size of its market and the human capital that exists in this common market to claim its previous position in world markets. On the other hand, I would much rather see Europe pursuing that in peaceful industries rather than in the context of national security and building up the military.
Actually, if I can add, So first, I agree with everything that's just been said, and to amplify that is we don't eat tanks. So jobs that produce tanks that aren't eventually used in war are like jobs digging holes and filling them in. They aren't actually economically productive for society. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have national security. Obviously, we should. Those are the tanks that actually, we need some number of tanks. But you really want to minimize that. You want to choose the number of tanks that stops aggression and not one tank more. Not that you know what that number is. So that is to say, I don't look, unlike the space program, which in the end probably will prove to be productive, I don't look at the production of tanks as being that's something that we want to have the least of that we can get away with. And so it's kind of even more extreme, in other words, is that's not a great thing to centralize authority. I wound up having dinner with a guy Polish executive who exported some auto parts to the rest of Europe. And he said, I have to deal with a completely different set of regulations in every European country. And it just makes it hard, is I've got to have a person to deal with France and a person to deal with Italy and so on, because they all have different regulations. And I'd say that's it's not a common market in the way the United States is. Right? There's some exceptions in the United States, like if you produce chickens in Texas and you want to send them to California, California insists that they had some large amount of space and that Texas does not. And so we think the chickens are being tortured and they don't. I live in California. And so there are some impediments, but there are very few of those impediments in the United States. So if you produce goods in the United States, mostly you can send them anywhere in the United States. That's not true here, and that is kind of important. And that's not to say that you don't want to reflect national or state preferences, but a lot of those are about protectionism. They aren't actually about reflecting the true will of the French people. It's let's make sure the French companies don't have to compete with the Polish companies. And so I would argue that there's a long way to go. And I haven't said anything about Andreu's question. Fasten your seatbelts for the next 4 years. I'm kind of glad my parents didn't live to see the destruction of NATO. I hesitate to think. My father flew bombing missions here in 1944 and 1943, and I fear for what he would think about what my country has become. And in particular, now also let me say that there's a special relationship between the United States and Britain, a phrase that was apparently invented by Winston Churchill. I don't think in the end that Americans think much about Europe. There's in the end, that Trump may, but that's just something it's politics. It's not actually, he's not representing the will of his people. He's convincing them that these are bad people because we're the good people. And that's the narrative. And I don't think there's any reality to this in the sense that there are, actually I'm going to finish with the following observation. I've become much more in favor of protesting. And what drove that was I went and toured Vietnam. And it turns out the Vietnamese don't look at the American people. They blame Richard Nixon and the American government, but they don't think that was the American people. And as a result, you're actually, as an American, treated pretty well when you visit Vietnam, because you're not viewed as being the people that drop so many bombs on them.
But they hate the French.
What?
They hate the French.
They do hate the French, yes. They definitely hate the French. And actually, I make the France has bailed us out twice. We've bailed them out twice. Let's call that even. So I think you shouldn't view you should be like the Vietnamese and not view the American government's state perspective as being the American perspective. Trump's popularity now is down to the low 30s. That's that's actually a testament. He's managed to be the least popular president at this point in his term. Yeah, and so let me just end with that.
Okay, so in this positive note, let's leave it at here. Thank you very much.